Wow, Bitcoin breaking $100,000. Did you ever think we'd see the day hitting 103,332.30 on December 4th? That's huge. So now you're probably thinking, okay, what's next? What does 2025 hold for Bitcoin? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. Expert predictions, some wild scenarios, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better sense of where things might be headed.
It's fascinating. You know how quickly the narrative around Bitcoin can shift? Just a year ago, there was a lot of doubt, even talk of it being like a fading trend.
And now, everyone's suddenly a believer again. But what really fueled this rocket ride in 2024? I know there are a few big factors.
Absolutely. The first one we have to talk about is ETFs, those exchange-traded funds. Finally getting approved by the SEC, that was a game changer because it meant everyday investors, folks who maybe weren't comfortable navigating crypto exchanges directly, suddenly had a simple way to get in on the action.
So it brought a level of legitimacy
Yeah.
and accessibility that wasn't there before.
Exactly. And then you have the regulatory winds shifting, particularly in the U.S. with the new administration. There's a sense that things are loosening up, that the government might take a more hands-off approach, which could encourage further growth.
And then, of course, you can't ignore the big players jumping into the pool. Companies, hedge funds, even pension funds. They're all starting to dip their toes into Bitcoin.
Right, and that's adding fuel to the fire. When these major institutions start putting their money into Bitcoin, it sends a signal to the market that this is a serious asset, not just some speculative plaything.
So let's get to the juicy part. What do the experts think Bitcoin's price will do in 2025? I've got some predictions here, and let me tell you, there's a wide range of opinions.
Always fun to see what the crystal ball says. What are we looking at?
Okay, so Galaxy Digital, they're feeling pretty bullish. They're predicting Bitcoin could hit $150,000 by mid-2025 and potentially even reach $185,000 by the end of the year.
That's a pretty optimistic outlook. What's their reasoning behind that?
Well, they're banking on even more institutional adoption. Think big banks, maybe even sovereign wealth funds getting involved. And they believe that the regulatory landscape will continue to become more favorable. They even hinted at the possibility of governments exploring the creation of Bitcoin reserves. Imagine that. Bitcoin as part of a nation's official reserves.
Now, that would be a seismic shift. I'm curious, are there any predictions even higher than that?
Oh, there are. Bitwise, for example, thinks we could see 200,000.
Uh-huh.
And they have this wild card scenario where Bitcoin hits, get this, 500,000.
$500,000 of Bitcoin. That's quite a leap.
Right. Their thinking is that if the U.S. government were to actually create a Bitcoin reserve, it would trigger a massive surge in demand. Of course, that's a big if. But it's certainly food for thought.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone is quite so exuberant, though. Vinake, for example, is a bit more cautious. They're predicting a maximum of 180,000. But they're also warning about volatility. They emphasize that Bitcoin is still a risky asset, and that significant price swings are to be expected.
It's a good reminder that while the potential upside is enormous, investing in Bitcoin isn't for the faint of heart.
Absolutely. And just to balance things out even further, we have Rania Gul from XS.com, who's suggesting that we could actually see a market correction in 2025, bringing prices back down to around 85,000.
Interesting. What's driving her more cautious outlook?
Well, she points to factors like the expiration of options contracts, which could lead to a sell-off. And she also emphasizes that macroeconomic conditions, like interest rate hikes or a global recession, could put downward pressure on Bitcoin's price. So while the overall sentiment is pretty bullish, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There are definitely risks to consider.
It's important to have these different perspectives. It reminds us that predicting the future is an imprecise science, especially when it comes to something as volatile as Bitcoin.
Exactly. But beyond the price predictions, there's a whole lot more going on in the Bitcoin ecosystem. What really has me excited is the growth of decentralized finance, or DeFi, built on the Bitcoin blockchain. It's like a parallel financial system is emerging, and it's growing at an incredible pace.
I'm glad you brought up DeFi, because that's where things get really interesting. This is about more than just buying and holding Bitcoin. It's about using it to create entirely new financial tools and services.
For those who might be hearing about DeFi for the first time, can you give us a quick rundown of what it is and why it's such a big deal, particularly for Bitcoin?
Sure. Think of it this way. DeFi aims to recreate traditional financial services, but without the need for those big intermediaries like banks or brokers. Imagine getting a loan, earning interest on your savings, or trading assets all directly on the blockchain without involving a bank.
So it's all about cutting out the middleman. and giving individuals more control over their finances.
Exactly. And because it's all powered by smart contracts, these self-executing agreements on the blockchain, everything happens automatically and transparently. There's no need for trust or reliance on a third party.
That sounds pretty revolutionary.
It is. And while Bitcoin wasn't initially designed with DeFi in mind, thanks to innovations like second-layer solutions, developers are finding ways to build these DeFi applications on top of the Bitcoin blockchain.
I've heard about these second-layer solutions. Can you explain what they are and why they're so important for Bitcoin's evolution?
Sure. Think of them as add-on layers to the Bitcoin network that help to scale and speed up transactions. The original Bitcoin blockchain can only handle a limited number of transactions per second, and fees can be high during peak times. Second-layer solutions, like the Lightning Network, address these limitations by processing transactions off-chain, making them much faster and cheaper.
So it's kind of like building express lanes on a highway to relieve congestion.
That's a great analogy. These second-layer solutions are essential for making Bitcoin-based DeFi practical for everyday use. And the growth potential is enormous. Some experts predict that the Bitcoin-based DeFi market could be worth over $30 billion by 2025, double what it is today.
That's staggering. And it seems like we're just at the tip of the iceberg. In terms of what's possible with DeFi on Bitcoin, what are some of the most exciting developments you're seeing in this space?
We're already seeing platforms emerge that allow you to lend out your Bitcoin and earn interest, trade Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies without using centralized exchanges, and even create stablecoins pegged to the US dollar. It's like a whole parallel financial system is being built right before our eyes.
Okay, but let's be realistic for a moment. There are always challenges and roadblocks when it comes to new technologies, especially in the world of finance. What are some of the potential obstacles that Bitcoin could face on its path to mainstream adoption in 2025?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is regulatory uncertainty. Governments around the world are still grappling with how to regulate Bitcoin and DeFi. One new regulation could change the game completely, especially in major markets like the US and the EU. And then, of course, there's the inherent volatility of Bitcoin.
Right. That's something you and Ronnie Agulico both mentioned. It's a reminder that Bitcoin is still a relatively young asset, and its price can swing dramatically.
And that volatility can be a major deterrent for some investors, especially those who are used to the relative stability of traditional markets.
So what you're saying is that while the potential rewards are high, so are the risks.
Exactly. And it's important for anyone considering investing in Bitcoin to understand those risks and only invest what they can afford to lose.
And we can't forget about the competition, right? There are other cryptocurrencies out there, like Ethereum and Solana, that are also innovating and attracting investors and developers.
Absolutely. The crypto landscape is constantly evolving, and Bitcoin isn't the only game in town. So while it has a strong first-mover advantage and a dedicated community, it can't afford to rest on its laurels.
So we've got this fascinating mix of bullish predictions, groundbreaking innovations in DeFi, but also some significant challenges and risks. All in all, it looks like 2025 could be a defining year for Bitcoin.
It's definitely shaping up to be a pivotal year, with the potential for both enormous growth and unexpected twists and turns. We'll have to see how it all plays out. But one thing is for sure, it's going to be an exciting ride.
And that's just part one of our deep dive into Bitcoin in 2025. Join us in the next part as we explore the other fascinating facets of this ever-evolving world, like the impact of Bitcoin mining and the potential social and geopolitical implications.
Sounds good. You know, it's interesting how the conversation surrounding Bitcoin has evolved. We used to talk about it as like this radical idea, a challenge to the traditional financial system. Now it's being embraced by those very institutions it was supposed to disrupt.
It's almost like Bitcoin is trying to walk this tightrope between being the rebel and joining the establishment. Does this influx of institutional money compromise Bitcoin's original vision of decentralization?
That's a great question. And there are definitely valid concerns about the potential for co-optation. When you have these massive financial players entering the space, it can feel like they're trying to exert control, to kind of bend Bitcoin to their will.
Like the big banks trying to tame the wild stallion of crypto.
Exactly. But at the same time, there's this incredible surge of innovation happening within the Bitcoin ecosystem, particularly in the DeFi space, that is very much aligned with the original spirit of decentralization.
Right, as we talked about earlier, all these new platforms and protocols are cropping up, making Bitcoin more versatile and accessible. And they're largely being built by independent developers and communities, not by big corporations.
That's a key point, the real innovation, the pushing of boundaries. is often happening at the grassroots level,
Mm.
driven by the same ethos of empowerment and individual freedom that was there from the beginning. So it's this fascinating push and pull, a tension between centralization and decentralization. That's playing out in real time.
It's almost like a tug of war, with the future of Bitcoin hanging in the balance.
In a way, yes, and the outcome of this tug of war is far from certain. It's one of the things that makes following Bitcoin so compelling. You never know what's going to happen next.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into this DeFi revolution you mentioned. For someone who's just starting to learn about this, how would you explain what DeFi is and why it's causing such a buzz in the Bitcoin world?
Think of DeFi as a way to reinvent traditional financial services using blockchain technology. Instead of relying on banks or other intermediaries to handle things like lending, borrowing, or trading, DeFi allows you to do these things directly with others, peer-to-peer, using smart contracts.
So no more dealing with banks, no more worrying about their fees or regulations.
Right. That's the idea. You have more control, more transparency, and potentially lower costs. Now, Bitcoin wasn't originally designed for DeFi. Its early focus was on being a digital currency, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. But thanks to those second-layer solutions we discussed earlier, developers are finding ingenious ways to build DeFi applications on top of the Bitcoin blockchain.
And as you mentioned, the growth potential here is phenomenal. What kinds of things can we expect to see happening in the Bitcoin-based DeFi space in 2025?
We're already seeing platforms emerge that allow you to lend out your Bitcoin and earn interest. Imagine instead of your Bitcoin just sitting in a wallet, you can put it to work and generate passive income.
That sounds way more appealing than the measly interest rates you get from traditional savings accounts these days.
Exactly. And because it's all decentralized, you don't have to trust a bank or a company to manage your funds. You have complete control. Then there are decentralized exchanges, where you can trade Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies directly with other users without going through a centralized exchange, like Coinbase or Binance.
So more control of your trades, less reliance on these big companies, and potentially lower fees.
Exactly. And there are platforms working on stablecoins pegged to the US dollar that are built on top of Bitcoin. These could be used for everyday transactions, making Bitcoin more practical for buying coffee or paying bills. It's all about expanding the utility of Bitcoin beyond just being a store of value.
It sounds like Bitcoin is evolving from just being a digital asset to becoming a whole financial ecosystem. But with all this excitement around DeFi, it's easy to get caught up in the hype. What are some of the risks that people need to be aware of before diving into Bitcoin-based DeFi?
One of the biggest risks is the complexity of these systems. DeFi protocols can be difficult to understand, even for experienced investors. There's a steep learning curve, and you need to be comfortable dealing with technical concepts and managing your own security.
So it's not just about downloading an app and clicking a few buttons. There's a lot more responsibility on the user side.
Absolutely. And because it's a relatively new space, there's also a lot of regulatory uncertainty. Governments are still trying to figure out how to approach DeFi, and new regulations could emerge that could impact the way these platforms operate.
It's like navigating uncharted territory, both technologically and legally.
That's a good way to put it. And then, of course, there's always the risk of bugs or vulnerabilities in the code. These protocols are complex, and even small errors can have significant consequences.
So doing your due diligence, researching the platforms carefully before investing any money, is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. DeFi can be incredibly rewarding, but it's not without its risks. It's important to understand those risks and only invest what you can afford to lose.
Okay, so we've talked about DeFi, which is all about decentralization. But then we have these centralized exchanges, like Coinbase and Binance, which seem to represent the opposite. How do they fit into the Bitcoin landscape?
Centralized exchanges have been the main gateway for most people to buy and sell Bitcoin. They provide a more user-friendly experience, offer a wider range of services, and often have better liquidity.
So they're kind of like the on-ramp to the crypto world for many people.
Yeah.
Especially those who are new to Bitcoin.
Exactly. But there's a growing tension between these centralized platforms and the decentralized ethos of Bitcoin.
Because they represent the very thing that DeFi is trying to move away from, control and centralization.
Exactly. Centralized exchanges have custody of your funds. They're subject to regulations and hacks, and they can even censor transactions. So there's a push within the Bitcoin community to move towards more decentralized solutions.
But for now, they're still a necessary part of the ecosystem for most people.
For many, yes. But it's exciting to see the development of decentralized exchanges. That could potentially challenge the dominance of these centralized platforms in the future.
So what about governments? How are they reacting to all of this innovation happening in the Bitcoin world?
Governments around the world are still trying to figure out how to approach Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general. It's a mixed bag of approaches.
Some are more open, like El Salvador, which made Bitcoin legal tender. Others are more cautious, perhaps worried about things like money laundering or tax evasion.
Exactly, and the regulatory landscape is constantly evolving. New regulations could emerge that could impact everything, from Bitcoin mining to DeFi platforms to the way individuals buy and sell Bitcoin.
It's a constantly shifting landscape.
Yeah.
And it's important for anyone involved in the Bitcoin space
Yeah.
to stay informed about these changes.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic environment. And one of the keys to success in this space is to be adaptable and informed.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, from DeFi to centralized exchanges to the evolving role of governments. It's clear that the world of Bitcoin is complex and constantly evolving. But there's one more aspect that I think is crucial to discuss: the impact of Bitcoin mining. It's become a hot-button issue, with strong opinions on both sides.
You're talking about the environmental impact, right?
Exactly. Some people argue that Bitcoin mining is an environmental disaster, while others claim that it's not as bad as it's made out to be. Can you help us unpack this issue and separate fact from fiction?
Sure. There's no doubt that Bitcoin mining consumes a lot of energy. It takes a significant amount of computing power to secure the network and process transactions.
And that energy has to come from somewhere, right?
Right. And that's where the concerns arise. If that energy is coming from power plants that burn fossil fuels, then Bitcoin mining is contributing to carbon emissions and climate change.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have this revolutionary technology with the potential to transform finance. On the other hand, it comes with an environmental cost.
That's a good way to put it. But it's important to remember that the environmental impact of Bitcoin mining isn't black and white. It really depends on where that energy is coming from.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. What are some of the different energy sources that are used for Bitcoin mining?
There are some miners who are using renewable energy sources, like solar, wind, and hydropower. This is obviously the most sustainable option.
So it is possible to mine Bitcoin in an environmentally friendly way.
Absolutely. And there is a growing movement within the Bitcoin mining industry to transition to renewable energy sources. This is being driven by a combination of factors, including environmental concerns, government incentives, and the desire to improve the public image of Bitcoin.
That's encouraging to hear. But what about the miners who are still using fossil fuels? Are they just ignoring the environmental impact?
It's not always that simple. Some miners are using natural gas, which is a cleaner burning fossil fuel than coal, and some are tapping into excess energy that would otherwise be wasted.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Some miners are setting up operations near oil and gas fields and using the excess gas that's often flared off, which is actually better for the environment than just releasing that gas into the atmosphere.
So they're essentially utilizing energy that would have been wasted anyway. That's a pretty clever solution.
Yeah, it is. And it highlights the fact that the relationship between Bitcoin mining and the environment is more nuanced than it's often portrayed.
Okay, so it's not just a simple case of Bitcoin mining being good or bad for the environment. It's more complicated than that.
Exactly. There are both positive and negative aspects to consider. And it's important to look at the bigger picture. Consider all the factors involved and not jump to conclusions based on simplified narratives.
So what can be done to make Bitcoin mining more sustainable in the long run?
There are a number of things that can be done. One is to encourage more miners to transition to renewable energy sources through government incentives or by consumers choosing to support miners that are using clean energy.
So it's about creating a market demand for sustainably mined Bitcoin.
Exactly. Consumers have power. Another solution is to develop more energy-efficient mining hardware. There are companies working on this, and it could significantly reduce the overall energy consumption of Bitcoin mining.
So it's a combination of things: cleaner energy sources, more efficient technology, and perhaps even changes in the way Bitcoin itself is mined.
Right. It's going to take a collective effort from miners, governments, developers, and consumers to make Bitcoin mining more sustainable. It's a challenge, but it's one that the Bitcoin community is increasingly taking seriously.
It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done, but also a lot of potential for positive change. Now, besides the environmental impact, there's another aspect of Bitcoin mining that I think is fascinating and perhaps a bit unsettling. Its geopolitical implications.
You're talking about how Bitcoin mining is becoming a global industry with the potential to shift power dynamics between countries.
Exactly. It's like a new kind of arms race. But instead of weapons, it's about who can control the most computing power to mine Bitcoin.
That's a great analogy. Countries are realizing that Bitcoin mining can be a source of economic and political power.
So it's not just about the money to be made from mining Bitcoin. It's about influence and control on a global scale.
Exactly. Remember how China used to be the dominant force in Bitcoin mining?
Yes, they controlled a huge percentage of the global hash rate.
Right. But when they cracked down on the industry, it created a vacuum that other countries were eager to fill. We're now seeing countries like the US, Kazakhstan, and Russia emerging as major mining hubs.
So the landscape is shifting, and the balance of power in the Bitcoin world is up for grabs.
Absolutely. And it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out. Control over Bitcoin mining could give countries a significant advantage in the global economy, not to mention potential influence over the future development of Bitcoin itself.
It's almost like a new kind of geopolitical game is emerging, with Bitcoin as the prize.
It is. And it's a game with high stakes. The outcome could have far-reaching implications for the global financial system, for international relations, and for the future of technology itself.
It's incredible to think how much impact this one technology is having on the world. It's changing the way we think about finance, energy, and now even geopolitics.
It's truly a paradigm shift. And we're just at the beginning of this journey. Who knows what the next chapter holds?
Well, on that note, let's move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore the social impact of Bitcoin, the potential for good, the potential for harm, and the ethical dilemmas this technology presents. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the price predictions and the DeFi revolution to the complex world of Bitcoin mining and its geopolitical implications. But there's one more crucial aspect we need to explore: the social impact of Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's an essential part of the conversation that often gets overshadowed by the technical and financial aspects. Bitcoin isn't just about code and algorithms, it's about people.
Yeah.
And it has the power to impact societies in profound ways, both positive and negative.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the hype of price movements and technological advancements, but at its core, Bitcoin is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill.
Precisely. And we're already seeing examples of both playing out in the real world. On the positive side, Bitcoin has the potential to empower individuals and communities, especially in places where traditional financial systems are failing or inaccessible.
Can you give me an example of that? I've heard stories about Bitcoin being used in countries with hyperinflation or limited access to banking services, but I'm curious to hear more about how that actually works.
Sure. Take Venezuela, for example. Their national currency has been ravaged by hyperinflation, making it practically worthless. People are struggling to afford basic necessities, and their savings have been wiped out in this kind of environment. Bitcoin can be a lifeline.
So how does it help?
Because Bitcoin operates independently of any central bank or government, it provides a more stable store of value. That's not subject to the same inflationary pressures. People can use it to send and receive money, buy goods and services, and even save for the future, all without relying on a failing financial system.
So it's like creating an alternative financial system, one that's more resilient and accessible to those who need it most.
Exactly, and we're seeing similar stories in other parts of the world, like in countries with high remittance fees. Bitcoin allows people working abroad to send money back home to their families more efficiently and at a lower cost than traditional remittance services.
That's a huge benefit for families who rely on those remittances to survive. So Bitcoin is not just about speculation and making a quick buck. It's about real people's lives and livelihoods. But you mentioned the potential for negative impacts as well. What are some of the concerns about Bitcoin being used for illicit activities?
Well, that's the dark side of Bitcoin's anonymity and decentralization. It can be attractive to criminals who want to operate outside the traditional financial system, making it difficult for authorities to track their activities.
So are we talking about things like money laundering, drug trafficking,
Yeah.
or even funding terrorism?
Unfortunately, yes. While these activities exist in the traditional financial system as well, Bitcoin's unique characteristics can make it easier for them to be carried out with a degree of anonymity. It's a challenge that regulators and law enforcement agencies are grappling with, trying to balance the benefits of Bitcoin with the need to prevent criminal activity.
It sounds like a constant cat and mouse game, trying to stay one step ahead of those who would exploit the system for illegal purposes.
It is, and it's an ongoing debate within the Bitcoin community as well. Some argue that any attempt to regulate Bitcoin will compromise its core principles of decentralization and privacy, while others believe that some level of regulation is necessary to prevent it from becoming a haven for criminals.
So it's a delicate balancing act, trying to foster innovation and adoption, while also mitigating the risks. But beyond these specific examples of good and bad uses, what are some of the broader ethical dilemmas that Bitcoin presents?
Well, one concern is the potential for financial exclusion. As Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies become more mainstream, there's a risk that those who lack access to technology or who are not comfortable using digital platforms could be left behind.
That's an important point. It's like the digital divide could be further amplified if access to financial services becomes increasingly reliant on cryptocurrencies.
Exactly. And then there are concerns about the environmental impact of Bitcoin mining, which we discussed earlier. The energy consumption required to secure the network raises questions about sustainability and whether the benefits of Bitcoin outweigh its environmental costs.
It seems like with any powerful technology, there are always trade-offs to consider. It's not just about the technology itself, but about how we choose to use it and what kind of future we want to create with it.
That's exactly right. It's about having these difficult conversations, weighing the potential benefits against the risks, and making conscious choices about how we want to shape the future of Bitcoin and its impact on our societies.
So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for Bitcoin and its social impact?
Well, the honest answer is no one knows for sure. Bitcoin is still a relatively young technology, and its full impact is still unfolding. It's a dynamic and evolving space, and the way it's used and regulated will shape its trajectory.
It's almost like we're writing the rule book as we go along, trying to figure out how to harness the power of this technology while mitigating its risks and ensuring that it benefits everyone.
That's a great way to put it. It's a collective effort that requires input from developers, policymakers, investors, and everyday users. The future of Bitcoin is not predetermined. It's something that we're all shaping together.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this. The Bitcoin revolution is still in its early stages. It's a complex and multifaceted phenomenon with the potential to reshape finance, empower individuals, and redefine the relationship between technology and society. It's crucial to stay informed, engage in these critical conversations, and be mindful of both the potential benefits and the risks as this technology continues to evolve.
And remember, the most important thing is to keep asking questions, to keep learning, and to keep exploring. The world of Bitcoin is full of surprises, and the future is full of possibilities.